My name is Douglas Fry, and I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And I'm here with my class. It's a seminar class for graduate students, and most but not all of the students are in the Anthropology of Peace and Human Rights Master's Program. What we're going to discuss today in the class is how there's a new science of nonviolence that can draw upon anthropological topics such as archaeology and nomadic forager studies, systems, peace systems, and so forth. So what the class is ready to do is to actually ask me some questions as we start this discussion. So who would like to ask the first one?
So what really was the purpose or theme of your book, Beyond War?
One of the big hindrances to moving beyond war, I think, is really people's attitudes and their beliefs that it's just not possible. So really, a theme of Beyond War is that human nature is so vast and flexible, and at the same time, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, it does bend towards peace. I present in the book a series of different arguments, and I draw heavily on the anthropological data to present this case that humans really aren't so nasty after all, that we do have a more positive human nature than many people in our society believe, and that therefore we can move beyond war.
So how has the science of nonviolence developed in the decades since Beyond War was published?
There's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, I think, meaning that in some way the idea that humans are not so nasty after all, or that we do have a positive potential for peace, that we actually are more cooperative than many people give us credit for. I sometimes call this a new paradigm or a new perspective, which certainly has nonviolence at the center, at the core. So I see this as really just a gradual accumulation of data, of information that supports this new perspective on humanity. For example, it's not talked about in the book, but there's recent studies from neuroscience which look at people's brains using fMRI data. And what they find is actually when we cooperate with each other, we get a activity in our reward centers of our brain, showing that it's actually positively, emotionally rewarding at a neurological level to cooperate. Studies like this continue to come out, which build on this whole body of evidence that gives a different perspective on humanity. So thank you for that question. Somebody else have a question for me? Casey?
In some of your ethnographic research, you talk a little bit about the behavior of rough and tumble play that exists in some peaceful societies as a way of learning how to control aggression. And I feel like in our society, we would probably look at that and we would just call it aggression versus an act that leads to peaceful behavior. What do you think that something like that would look like from a neuroscience perspective, or do you think that anything like that is being re-examined to see things that we traditionally called violent and instead realize that they're instead of catalysts for peace?
Rough and tumble is ubiquitous in the primates, and there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of ink spent on this one in terms of what is it good for and so forth. But it seems like a likely explanation is that rough and tumble play is a non-serious way to practice a serious behavior later on, and that would be you play fights so that you could fight later. In 2013, I put together an edited volume called War, Peace, and Human Nature, and there's a section of that book on restraint. And one thing that I think I would argue is happening as we speak and go forward is that people are realizing that being non-aggressive, being nonviolent, and showing that restraint is actually the main principle here. It's not the aggression, but it's how to control that aggression. So whether you're looking at human societies, we see examples of this in virtually any society. Even the most aggressive ones, sometimes the fighting has got a very ritualized, almost play-like atmosphere. Now, I don't mean play in the sense of playing, but in the sense like it's a play, it's choreographed. So when you look towards animals, we know these examples from ungulates of the beating, pushing on the horns of a variety of deer and other ungulates. The whole idea there is that the contest can be resolved, but that nobody gets hurt. It's a form of learning how to be controlled in fighting. An interesting example of this is when different monkey species have been isolated and not allowed to engage in play, and in fact be limited from social interaction as they're growing up, they actually are too aggressive. So what it suggests to me and to the scholars who have done this type of research is it's very important as you're a monkey child or a human child growing up to engage in some of this rough and tumble behavior, to learn your own limits, learn when to back off, and so on and so forth.
What role do norms and values play in peaceful societies and peace systems?
Well, you're mentioning another realm that's really interesting anthropologically. And on the one hand, just to give a little overview to this one first, there are a great number of peaceful societies. So this relates very directly to this whole idea of human nature, because if we were innately violent, then you'd really expect to see a lot of violence everywhere, and you wouldn't find societies that are so peaceful that aggression hardly ever occurs. And there are anthropological examples of this, whether we're talking about Semai from Malaysia or Ifaluk Atoll, a variety of other ones, Palayan people from India, and the list literally goes on and on. And then peace systems are an interesting concept, but what we find, a peace system is clusters of neighboring societies that don't make war on each other. If humanity had a natural inclination towards violence and warfare, there wouldn't be any peace systems. They'd be very, very hard to form if we were leaning in this way. But what we find instead are ethnographic examples where clusters of neighboring societies come together. In the peace systems, they tend to have, as a group, values that do not support war, but rather values that support getting along, a broader perspective of neighbors that sees them as human beings, that they're tolerant values. For example, if we go to the Xingu people from Brazil, there's a peace system there that consists of 10 different groups, 10 different tribes. There's different language represented in these groups. So they have a set of values that shows that aggression and war is an act of failed leadership. And also they said the worst thing you can do as a person is lose control and become violent. So they express their conflicts in other ways. They engage in verbal harangues sometimes if somebody is angry at somebody else. They also, interestingly, engage in wrestling and let their emotions out by wrestling with each other. Again, it's physical, but it's nonviolent. The intent is not to hurt or kill somebody, certainly. So that's a peace system where the values are very well represented.
Talk about a paradigm shift, and it seems like there is this other paradigm shift happening in basic sciences where environmental degradation is becoming more of an applied science problem. It's kind of making its way into social sciences as climate change is being more widely accepted as a human security threat. Do you think that this has the potential to create more conflict, or does it have the potential to create more peace, like peace systems, communities working together to work on this threat?
Well, one thing you said reminded me of the case of the Mardu people from Australia's western desert. And what you see there is the Mardu very clearly understand that they need each other, because the rainfall is so sporadic from one season to the next. Sometimes it's over here and sometimes it's 200 miles over there, and nobody knows where the rains will come this year. With the rains come water holes. With water holes and rain come vegetation. Of course, the animals aren't stupid. They want to eat and have water. They need water, so they come to those areas as well. So the Mardu people and their neighbors also congregate and move over a vast area of this western desert in order to share the resources. So it's another interesting anthropological case, which at first seems counterintuitive to many people in our culture, because we are thinking in terms of, oh, the resources, we want to fight over them, we need to protect our resources and not let others come in. But the problem here, the real, very real human problem, is that you can't do that. You just seal yourself into a patch of dry desert, and you need to move and share. So that's what they do, and Mardu and their neighbors don't engage in warfare, and they don't engage in feuding. And they understand, as the anthropologist says, that this would be suicidal to fight with each other, when instead they can say, okay, you're having a drought over there? Yeah, we have water this year? Of course, come over here. Next year, we'll probably be over in your area if you get the water and we don't. So at a global level, and in terms of thinking of nonviolence and this interesting question that you're raising, once we realize that we have that shared fate, we have that interdependence, that it's more likely. And especially when you have forces, leaders and other people writing and making films and social media putting forth that message, hey look, we're all in the same little boat here, we need to paddle together to get out of this problem. So I think there's some hope, but it's not certain. We have to work on this.
It seems like in Beyond War, many of the cross-cultural examples that you look at have values like immaterialism, extreme individuality, and a nomadic lifestyle that helps prevent violent conflict, but is really blatantly absent from the day-to-day lives of people in the industrial world. So I'm wondering how we take these lessons and translate them to our lives and how we promote that in our own actions every day.
So in Beyond War, the book that Kane is referring to, I discuss the nomadic foragers quite a lot. And the reason for doing that, though there's different reasons for doing it, but one is the nomadic foraging social organization is, it goes way back, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of years even. You could say that the whole genus Homo has been on the planet for about 2 million years, and they have lived in some form or another of the nomadic foraging, hunting type of lifestyle. So the idea is that if you want to gain some insights about human nature, about the human past, it would be very useful to study this type of rather simple nomadic social organization. And what we find then, to make generalizations, and it's possible to do this because you see the same patterns reflected around the world when you read descriptions of these cultures, you find that they tend to be very egalitarian overall. They have an ethos of equality, and in fact the social order is very egalitarian. Nobody has the power to give orders or enforce commands on others. And Kane mentioned individuality. When the nomadic forager researchers usually put a fancy jargon term of autonomy or personal autonomy on that. And what it means is, in terms of conflict, if somebody has a problem with other members of the band, they're likely just to pack up their few possessions and walk off, either by themselves or with their family. Maybe it's for the day, maybe it's for several weeks, or maybe it's more or less permanently, or a year or whatever. So they separate, they vote with their feet as a mechanism for dealing with conflict. So I make a big deal about the nomadic foragers for another reason, and that is, as a type of society, they're not warlike. Now you can find some exceptions ethnographically, and maybe they've been influenced in some cases by pastoralists. For instance, they will sometimes in East Africa fight with pastoralist groups. But as a group, and traditionally when there were basically only nomadic foragers, what is the point of fighting over something? So there's a lack of motivation. And we go into this in more detail in thinking about foragers. But to get to the heart of your question, what can we really learn or apply in a modern, industrial, settled down type of setting? And one thing I think is to understand the rich capacity for dealing with conflicts nonviolently. So this loops back into the science of nonviolence, because what we find, and it varies culture to culture, we find a whole series of mechanisms that nomadic foragers, and in fact people in any culture, use to deal with conflicts nonviolently. And we take these things for granted. So, you know, if someone in your family were to be murdered, chances are you're not going to go try to kill the person who killed your family member. You understand, you call the police, there's a judicial system. If the murderer is apprehended, they have a right to a trial, and so on and so forth. This is a sense providing justice or conflict resolution in a state system. But of course, not all societies have a state organization. So people talk it out. They have moots, they have the council of the elders, they have tribal councils. They come together and they talk it out. Usually elders are important, which is interesting because you know, in our modern Western societies, elders are not so much valued for their opinion or their wisdom. But in traditional societies, including these nomadic foragers, elders lot less of them, but they're really valued for their experience and the way to deal with things. So we didn't see in this class, but perhaps some of you have been in a different class where I showed a film about the foragers. It was called The Meat Fight, and the title of that film, as you might remember, was a misnomer because actually there was no fight at all, and this exactly makes the point. There was a headman from one tribe, and he helped to deal with a dispute between members of two other bands in this situation. And basically they talked it out. And at one point, one of the elders says, "This is not right. We can handle this peacefully. We need to follow the rules." So right away, there's rules, there's norms. Back to David's questions, there's values, that it's not right to fight. So the nomadic foragers and other societies, I think, open up our eyes to the fact that most of us deal with conflicts nonviolently, sometimes effectively, sometimes not, but there's mechanisms to deal with conflicts beyond just fighting. So that's one valuable lesson.
So for someone like me who comes from outside the program, this is stuff that I likely might never have heard of. And so my question to you is, your book is great, but how do we, get this information to people who aren't going to know where to look for it, not know to look up Beyond War? How do you reach the average person with this information?
Well, I think really a multi-pronged approach is where we go with this. One thing is my teaching here. I'm teaching you guys, as you just said, you probably never would have heard of hunter-gatherers and peace systems and thought about some of these human nature questions and so forth. So you have your own mind and your own life and your abilities. You're going to perhaps go out and share this with people, do your own writing and your own activities that sort of challenge the existing paradigm and put forth a more positive, nonviolent, pro-social view of human nature and how we can behave in our societies and in our globalized world. So that's just one thing. But also you mentioned the book Beyond War. I wrote that with the general public in mind. So I tried to avoid jargon terms and over technical language and so forth. And on the other side, tell some amusing stories. I hope you all found them amusing. And so even some jokes in there. So speak out, educate, write, blog, do what you do. There's this, it's Schopenhauer, right? Maybe you can help me as the historian, Nathan, but I know the gist of the quote is along the lines of, first a new idea is violently opposed, and then I don't know what comes next, but there's some sort of middle level of acceptance, and then finally it's taken as self-evident. It's not even a controversy. One of the strengths and I think joys of anthropology is that we question all the time. We're questioning, is that really a belief or is there evidence behind that? And are we looking at the world in a, through some angle? And it evolves, it changes. So I think this is just such a case where humans are not as nasty as we once thought they were. And in fact, we have a huge potential for peace. And this is very promising for humanity as we move into the 21st century. We're not destined to always make war of all against all. There's ways to do this differently. And that brings us back to peace systems, for example.
So you've written in the past that the EU could accurately be characterized as a peace system. Could you expound on the aspects of the European Union which make it a good example of a peace system?
Oh yeah, and of course the European Union is getting a lot of flack and people are writing all types of negative things about it and so forth. So I acknowledge that. But what I see as the real shining light to the European Union is the fact that after this incredibly devastating war, World War II, which came on the heels of many previous wars in Europe, people were just totally fed up with war. Virtually everybody had lost their schoolmates, their friends, their daughters, their husbands. Millions of people literally perished. The infrastructure was in disaster. They had had enough. War really was hell. With the history here was one key individual, Jean Monnet, who really pushed doggedly for doing something about this to prevent all future wars in Europe. And that is the key to the European Union. It was founded with the idea of we're going to prevent future wars on this continent. So peace was the prime motivator, and economic prosperity was a secondary motivator. And this is all very nicely documented in a series of articles and books about Monet, including his own memoirs. But he had this key idea. We need to form an overall, an overarching sense of governance. And just like in the United States, if you think back about our United States history, we did the same thing way back when, forming the federal union. So it was in some sense, you know, a copying of a tried and true idea. You bring disparate countries or disparate societies together under an overarching authority, an overarching governance. You develop a larger identity over time, where people in Europe now, can't speak for all of them, right? But a solid majority of people perceive themselves as Finns and Europeans, or French and European, Spanish and European. So this higher level of European identity is developing as we speak, literally. So these are all implications of a peace system that's very important. And the European Union, of course, shows that we have peace systems that can be carefully planned and historically documented and implemented in our political world today. So they're not just anthropological oddities that you would go down to Brazil and find 10 tribes who've managed to construct a peace system and they don't make war with each other. No, you can look to Europe, and they've constructed a peace system there. So thank you for raising the question of the European Union. It's, I think, a very important example. Why don't we just see if there's some messages you would like to get out there regarding nonviolence or some related topics. Caitlin, I'm sure you have some ideas.
I think that to have examples and like to be reading about all these people and all these movements that have worked successfully on a nonviolent scale is really great. And I think that that gives us hope to be able to implement our ideals further, because we all have different interests that are connected over this umbrella in our program. And so we all have this interconnectedness through that. Like, I want to implement my piece through law and legal advocacy for people who would not otherwise be able to attain that. And so I think, like with Casey wanting to say, like, peace apology, and like being able to implement that right now, like on a political level. So we each have our own like goals. I think it's great that we're all going about it in a different way and carrying that nonviolence with us in our daily lives.
I think all throughout our education we're told that we need to learn history, if not we're doomed to repeat it, but we learn it from a more narrow perspective, and that leaves a lot of room for bias. But I feel like kind of what we're doing here with peace studies is it's more interdisciplinary. So we're learning from anthropology, we're learning from evolution, ethology, primatology, science, and we're integrating it all in together, and that gives us a greater view of all of our history. Gives us a more stable, detailed starting point when it comes to resolving conflict and looking for sustainable peace solutions. And I think the really big takeaway message for me is that we learn that conflict and culture and society, they're all human created, so they can be human resolved. And if we think that they aren't human created and that it's just something that's always existed, then we don't seek resolutions to things like war.
You know, for someone like me who like doesn't, you know, come from a place of understanding about any of this, for like that kind of stuff to be present in what we've read, what we've talked about in class, has been so huge for me to just form an understanding of it and to be able to take that understanding and turn it into acceptance. Like, come from a place where, as people have said, like, we are taught that war is nature and that, you know, it's impossible to not have war. For someone like me who is a definitively war historian, like, this is what I do. And for me to take that background and then like this class to help flip that on its head has been such a big thing for me this semester.
Well, I want to thank my class for really taking part of this and asking me some challenging questions and also sharing some really poignant observations. The theme we started with and we've explored in different ways is the science of nonviolence, really from anthropological perspectives. And I just want to say that this is an exciting field of endeavor, and it also has real relevance to the world today. So in conjunction with the evidence coming out of other fields like neurology and primatology, we're really re-questioning what it means to be human. And as a closing thought, I think it's very exciting that we have a new paradigm which is really emphasizing this human potential for peace.